I reckon this is an interesting discussion. It's going to require a bit of honesty from listeners as to whether or not you fall into this category. But let's say that you've not been happy at work or something's got you back up and you're upset and you've kind of, on your social media account, you've flicked out something about your employer. Do you think that's acceptable? If it's, obviously having a crack at them. Do you think that that's acceptable, that your social media account, which might be a way that you communicate with lots of people often, and you suddenly put something up there about your workplace, that you should be punished, possibly reprimanded and sacked, whatever the case may be? If I told you that there was a push-on from the union movement in Australia to stop employers being able to take any action against someone that uses their social media to say something detrimental about the employer, would you be surprised? Well, don't be, because it's actually happening. There is a push-on to do that exactly. Stop employers being able to use what they've seen on someone's social media account to take action against them. Now, I don't know how this is going to play out, to be honest, because I've got my views. But anyway, let's get your reaction, 133 882. In the meantime, Sue Ellson is a career development practitioner and joins us on the line. Hi, Sue.
Hi, Gary.
This is interesting, isn't it? Because I'm not saying every day someone would, finish a bad day at work and put something out on social media, but I know it happens, and you certainly would know it happens. Do you think that it's reasonable to allow the unions to say leave workers alone when they put something out there?
Well, every organisation is supposed to have a social media policy, and a lot of organisations I've been to, they know there is one, they don't know what it says, and they haven't had any training on it. So there's been probably a bit of a breakdown in communication up until now. But I think what the unions are also trying to do is they're trying to stop the monitoring of that social media as well. So I personally would never bag an employer. I'm grateful for the payment that I receive from every employer.
Well said.
I would also like to say that if I've got an issue with them, I should bring it up with them, not share it publicly. But also legally, if it is something that they have published and, they've had a gripe, then the employer can take a copy of that and then go back to the person and say, please explain. And obviously, if it was in a criminal nature, then obviously the police would investigate. But, I think the reasonable person in the street would say, look, it's not okay to bag your employer publicly on social media.
You said there that, employers might just monitor a worker's social media account. Do you mean after they've employed them? Because I think there's I would have thought there's an accepted view now that, employers might go and have a look before they take you on in a job just to see what your profile looks like out there in the social media world. But you're saying like during someone's employment?
Yes, absolutely. So I heard a statistic some years ago that 75% of people will check you out online before a job interview and 95% before they offer it to you. But I've heard from a number of people that if somebody doesn't like them at work, then they'll start, scrolling past their social media profile and trying to look for something that could be, cause to suggest that perhaps they're not a good fit for the organisation anymore. Some people have obviously been targeted for that. But also when you think about the union movement being the sort of people trying to instigate this, obviously they would have a particular agenda to make sure employers are accountable. And obviously some people would use their social media following to try and make sure that, employers stay on the straight and narrow, I suppose. So, trying to protect those people who are advocating for others, I presume. I mean, I can't say exactly, but that's what I'm guessing is the case.
And obviously Victoria seems to be the hub for this starting. Is that your sense of it, that it's starting with some sort of inquiry that's going on in the Parliament of Victoria and submissions have been made?
Yes, my understanding it is based here. I don't know how it's going to get up. Obviously, there's been a lot of changes to workplace law recently with the right to disconnect and a lot of governance requirements for organisations and small businesses only get an extra 12 months to sort of implement it as well. So I think, technically a lot of people are going to be up in arms about it because it does seem like another impost and another thing that they have to monitor. And sometimes it's not even the employer. It could be a fellow employee who, is bullying you that could be going down this path. So in that sense, yes, they need protection. And then the other component of what they're talking about is surveillance. So I don't know about you, but I've always been very loyal to my employer and turned up on time and not taken sickies. But there are other people who are not like that. And so there's obviously a lot of technology around now. So a lot of employees know that they're being surveyed, but they don't necessarily know how that's happening. So this sort of discussion that is being prompted by this inquiry could open the door on that and make it important for an employer to be more transparent about how they're monitoring your behaviour. And let's not forget that some employees will use technology to show that they are online and moving their mouse automatically for them. So, there should be trust on both sides. Don't necessarily agree regulation is automatically the answer for some of these things.
Because, if you talk about that kind of surveillance level, is it fair for an employer who, let's say an employer does have an issue with an employee and they haven't got the sort of grounds to sack them, but they do look at their social media account and they see that they're involved in something that's unsavoury or they're not setting a great standard for the company if anyone can link them to the company. Is that grounds enough? Like you might be doing something out of hours that you would, that your employer would be aghast at. But have they got any right over that?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't sort of argue the case for that. But I do understand that if the employer saw that and felt uncomfortable about it and had already explained to the employee, here's our guidelines, here's our code of conduct, here's our values, this is all outside of this. Imagine if it was a government employee, that could be very serious.
Yep.
So technically what they should do is bring it to the employee first to say, please explain. And then if there's not a reasonable explanation, then obviously it can go further. I guess the challenge is we've got to remember, I've been online since 2001, we've got to remember every single thing we do online is potentially public. Yep. Now, the employer does have no right to go in and log into your accounts or ask who to be friends with you on social media or whatever, but I would say it's reasonable to expect that they wouldn't be going around bagging you. And what are we not allowed to talk about? Sex, politics and religion. If they just had a different political view, would that be grounds to sack them? Yeah, you'd have to talk to a lawyer about that. That's beyond my scope.
And the other one I reckon might be interesting is I know, that like a group of employees working for a company might have a WhatsApp chat group.
Yes.
And they might, air all of their concerns and their issues with a company through their WhatsApp. If that was to sort of break free, like one of those people was to pass it on to a employer, a boss, and this is all the sort of talk that's going on within that chat group, where do you reckon that would sit?
Again, really tricky. Gary, I am risk averse. I'm an ex-banker, so I would not put anything in writing that I didn't want on the front page of a newspaper or on talkback radio. There's just no way I would ever put anything in writing because anything that's put in writing can be used in court. So even though you might think it's private, I remember another person, they were in a WhatsApp group and the conversation got really aggro and they had to leave it because they didn't want to be seen to be participating in a takedown of another staff member. So, at the end of the day, we probably all have to take a little bit of personal responsibility here. And we know that it's wrong to bitch about your boss, and particularly in writing. So
that's the problem. And that's the new norm now, isn't it? At the end of the mobile phone keyboard, that is the way it's done. The days of just sort of like having a beer at the end of the week and talking about stuff, there's just this kind of disconnect where people don't realise what they're doing when they're just tapping away at their keyboard and sending a message to 25 other people and the consequences that could follow. I don't think people have really worked it out yet.
No, and the scary part is, Gary, that over 50% of the Australian population has access to an employee assistance program. So they have got somebody they could call, it's confidential, and then they could air their grievances and try and, resolve it. But less than 4% actually use it. So, because they fear that, it's still going to get back to the employer. And there's a lot of training materials around about having difficult conversations, from the Fair Work Ombudsman website and the Workplace Gender Equality Agency has a whole bunch of stuff. There's resources around to help educate people deal with these issues. rather than just bitch about it. And I've always adopted a solution-focused approach. So let's not just whinge, let's try and work out a solution. So, yeah, and obviously people haven't been able to work out a solution, so they go, oh, let's legislate again. And, I don't necessarily agree that's an answer.
Well, let's see whether anything comes from this particular inquiry that's being looked at in Victoria and see whether it spreads, if it's successful. Thanks very much for joining us, Sue.
Thanks, Gary.
Not all disrespect.